author of Blood Red Lines, How Nativism Fuels the Right. Brenden O'Connor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's start with, what you describe here is the notion of borders as not simply a line that demarks two countries, but has it's both tangible, but it's legal, etc. Explain that concept to us.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that what we need to understand, particularly in this context, is that the border, it has a function. Like you said, it separates, one sovereign nation state from another. But particularly in the context of the U.S. border with Mexico, it's a tool for managing the flow of labor and the flow of workers and the flow of people. And as such, it is something that in very real material ways is not just a geographic location. And you can hear this in the way that especially politicians and other figures on the right talk about the border and talk about that every state is a border state. And this is framed in terms of expanding the immigration apparatus to be a nationwide thing. It's not just about apprehending people making the border crossing, but it's getting at a deeper truth that there is a way of managing and surveilling people that has been perfected at the border, but that is applied everywhere.
And it's also about sort of creating multiple tiers of, citizenship is just, it's obviously just a construct, right? It's actually creating multiple tiers of human beings, essentially. And also you can look at that through the sort of, the planes of both citizenship, but also workers and just sheer humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of the things that became most clear to me in the course of my research and reporting on this book is that the kind of nativist impulse to protect citizenship and protect a kind of, particularly racialized white idea of citizenship is not actually in opposition to the interests of capital and the industries that need migrant labor. These things actually work together, and it serves the interests of the employers who rely on migrant labor to have a kind of robust nativist politics that marginalizes and makes a particular layer of workers especially vulnerable and especially exploitable. And the fact that there are millions of workers in this country who exist in a state of deportability and whose families are under this threat, even if those families are of mixed citizenship status, this has a paralyzing effect on people's ability to live, people's ability to organize, people's ability to stand up for themselves in exploitative conditions. And so these things really work together in complicated and sometimes apparently contradictory ways. But that is, it's an important thing to keep in mind.
Let's just examine that contradiction, because the contradiction is between this sort of notion of like a fear on the sort of nativist right. And, when we're talking about this, and we'll get into sort of the taxonomy a little bit, but broadly speaking, we know the different types of groups we're talking about here who express that, ranging from Congressman Steve Scalise, who we just played a clip of, through the Proud Boys into, whatever it is, the 3%ers. So you have that nativism, which is, we're being replaced in some way, and it's also racialized, of course. But then you also have this business desire for cheap labor, as you say, and this is all, and these interests fit under one umbrella. You also refer to this concept of border fascism. Just explain this contradiction more and how, you've touched on it, but how it resolves itself in the context of essentially the right?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that kind of we are entering a period right now where this contradiction is increasingly unstable, and it has been resolved in a particular way in the context of the Republican Party over the past half a century or so, where the kind of logic of the racialized logic of citizenship and nation building was subordinated to the interests of capital, the interest of business, the interests of industry. Um, and what I call border fascism and is the process of and the emergence of um, a political logic where that is sort of inverted, and the interests of race making and the anxiety and the fear over replacement and so-called white genocide is taking on greater momentum, greater influence, and is able to exert itself against the interests of capital that it has kind of been playing second fiddle to. In the course of in the course of the Trump administration, I think that what we saw was that ultimately the establishment Republican Party, the donor class, the interests of capital kind of remained in the driver's seat. But I think a large amount of the instability that we're seeing, the fracturing of the Republican Party, can be ascribed to this contradiction no longer sort of being as stable as it once was.
That's fascinating. There's a word for that, or there's two words for it. It's called Tucker Carlson.
I was
Yeah.
That is when Tucker Carlson, all of a sudden people are like, why is this guy talking about corporate elites? And it is an indication of a shift in the sort of the equilibrium that had been established. I mean, and I think this first sort of reared its head, it seems to me, back in, I think it was 2004, maybe it was, or 2005, when there was an attempt by the Bush administration to forge an immigration policy. Karl Rove was convinced that they need to get on the right side of immigration in some fashion for their electoral chances going forward. And there was such a massive pushback by the talk radio right, which I think, sort of is the sort of, the better, the public facing part of some of these undercurrents that you write about here. And that was sort of the first indication that they're not going to go quietly on this, and they have amassed a tremendous amount of power.
And then Trump got elected.
But it's hard to know what the cause and effect is, right? That's a feedback loop on some level. And so what is it in your mind? And we'll get to, we have so much to get to in terms of your book, but what is it in your mind that has shifted that equilibrium? Why do we have Tucker Carlson saying this, whereas, 20 years ago, it was John Kasich on there saying we need to worry about business interests?
Right. Yeah, no, that's kind of the operative question, because you're right that there are antecedents, and, these forces didn't just come from nowhere, but obviously something has changed to allow them to gain as much influence and prominence as they have. And I think that one big part of this is the broader hegemonic crisis of neoliberal capitalism that we are all kind of in one way or another trying to figure out and respond to. Neoliberal capitalism, as built and established and perpetuated by both the Democratic and Republican parties, has, been a way to protect the interests of capital and allow it to move freely around the world, kind of smoothly across borders. And this is at the same time that, borders are being militarized, that borders are being locked down, and that domestic white workers in the US are seeing their industries collapse. And this kind of reached a crisis point in 2007, 2008, and that I think has reopened a window for this particular nativist kind of politics to gain traction, and to make a challenge to the dominant way of managing and organizing society that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have embraced over the past 4 decades.
You have you also have this sort of I guess, like, this ties in on some level to demographic anxiety, and but that demographic anxiety is associated in some respects with the loss of power for labor. I mean, it's an interesting. I think this is this is an issue that we talk about on this program quite a bit, right? And how does the loss of economic power, or in this instance, just even the institutions of labor that used to provide the economic power for a broad array of folks, how does that end up creating or enhancing demographic anxiety? Will you talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, so I think that one answer to that might be that in the absence of the kinds of institutions and organizations like the labor movement that might offer a way for people to access different kinds of identity and different kinds of solidarity with people unlike themselves, in whatever way. There's a retreat to identity, and there's a retreat to racial identity. I actually don't think that there's been a lot of discourse about the kind of disaffected white working class and the effects of deindustrialization, and that's not to be dismissed. But I don't really think that is kind of the primary base for the nativist politics that I describe in my book. I think that those are people that are recruited into this political project, and an appeal is made to them. But this doesn't originate necessarily with the factory worker who in the industrial Midwest who's out of a job now.
Go ahead.
Well, you trace it back to 1970s, like, population control discourse, and how that plays into environmental discussions now. And we just mentioned Tucker Carlson, but he's going on his program basically saying population overcrowding, and that's going to result in catastrophic environmental consequences, etc. Can you talk about the mirroring, really, of that discourse from that you highlight in your book to what we're seeing today, because it's so prescient, based on the nativism of somebody like Tucker Carlson and his section of the right wing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that this is a way for, not that Tucker necessarily needs to figure out like how to be more palatable. Like, he's sort of very much leaning into his vulgar racism, but to talk about overpopulation, to talk about the effect of kind of too many people are like littering and making green spaces dirty, is a way of, I think, sublimating certain kinds of racial anxiety for a more liberal milieu. And this is, there's a there's a line, like you said, that can be drawn back to the early environmentalist and conservationist movements of the late 60s and early 70s, from which people like John Tanton and Cordelia Scaife-May, who I write about extensively in this book, emerged, and whose experiences in those movements informed their cultivation of the nativist nonprofits and think tanks that they founded and developed, and that then provided personnel and policy for the Trump administration. I think that, you know, we've seen a split. You know, this is not to say necessarily that like environmentalism is racist or something like that. And in fact, you know, John Tanton very explicitly was like, these people aren't racist enough for me, all the way back in the 70s. But that there is a history of a kind of ambivalence and a kind of intermingling in these movements, of some pretty dangerous ideas.
Let's get into Tanton and Scaife, or I guess Scaife-May, but I think the Scaife is sort of like the sort of the operative part of that,
Yeah.
in terms of what fuels this. I mean, why did you? I mean, you focused really. I mean, these are your two protagonists in the book that are there in terms of driving this particular, I guess, coexistence of what appears to be contradictory impulses on some level. Why those two? And then, you know, tell us about them individually. But why these two? Did you pick these two?
Yeah, so I mean, kind of working backwards, at the beginning of the Trump administration, I was interested to try and see, like, where are the people that Trump is making, where the political appointees in the Department of Homeland Security and its various affiliated agencies, like, where are these people coming from? Who is carrying out the Trump, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon kind of anti-immigrant agenda? And what I found was that there was a network of nonprofits, three primary ones: the Federation for American Immigration Reform, Center for Immigration Studies, and Numbers USA, that have been around for many, many years, kind of at the periphery of the Republican Party, who during Trump's campaign gained a lot of influence, and provided many of these political appointees. And in looking at the history of these organizations, I found that they were all either founded by or cultivated by this guy, John Tanton, who had a very close relationship with Cordelia Scaife-May, the younger sister of Richard Scaife, who, you know, she was a millionaire heiress to the Scaife and Mellon fortunes, and basically was his benefactor, and provided him with tons of money over the years to create these organizations that essentially launder, or put a kind of pseudo-intellectual veneer on just rank, classically American, anti-immigrant nativist sentiment, but really, you know, put it in, translated into terms that can be put into policy, which is what we saw in the Trump administration.
I have to say, like, you know, it's not hard for me to imagine you have, you know, having written like maybe the story, like a story of a much more benign sort of, you know, artist who has a benefactor and just making beautiful paintings, and this, you know, but instead it's just that Tanton creates all of this sort of just machines to pump out hate. In fact, before we played the Scalise clip, I was like, when was the last time like anything in the news has come up about migrant caravan? And I can tell you, it was about 2.5 weeks ago, and you can find it on the Center for Immigration Studies, reporting on the migrant caravan that's forming. And so just to give folks an example, and then this gets laundered through the various right-wing channels, and there it is. So give us a sense of, all right, so TAN, develops these institutions. Give us a sense of sort of this world. You've got the think tanks, if you will, in the form of Center for Immigration Studies and other things. Who's using this material? I mean, we saw it being put to use in the context of the Trump administration, but on the ground, give us a taxonomy of these different groups that you have also done a lot of reporting on. Right.
Yeah. So there are, there are some kind of, there's not as much, I think, direct overlap between the sort of elite policy sphere of the, of these movements, and the street-based organizations like the Proud Boys, or not all street. Many of them are very online. The so-called alt-right. There are some connections. So, for example, the chairman of the Proud Boys, a guy named Enrique Terrio, was a very high-ranking volunteer on the Trump campaign. He was the director of Latinos for Trump in Florida. And so, there are sort of, specific instances where there are people who kind of bridge the divide. But for the most part, at least in recent years, these have been, I think, pretty, organizationally separate phenomena, but they are responding to the same kind of political conditions and drawing on similar legacies and traditions in American politics, but kind of going about the way that they approach and practice their politics in different ways.
Do we know if the financing is that different? I mean, I've always wondered, how Gavin McInnes had those shows at one point, and Gavin McInnes was the former head of the Proud Boys. At one point, he invited me onto a show that he was trying to do, in sort of his comeback tour. I can't remember if this was one or two. It must have been like 2 or 3 years ago. And he offered me $5,000 to go on his show.
Wow.
And it is literally like a 20-minute drive from here. He was going to send me a car. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no, being in this business, there's no formula where that $5,000, he gets that $5,000 back. And now maybe he was just self-financing it, but my sense is, you look at like some of these right-wing outlets, there's a lot of money sloshing around there. I don't know if it comes from SCAFE necessarily, but you've got these sort of parallel tracks that are just doing sort of like the haute racism and the low racism. and they're proceeding along, and they're in sync on some level.
I think that's correct. I would also love to know where the money, where Gavin's money is coming from. You're right that there is a massive media ecosystem for this that, to me, remains pretty opaque. And I think to a lot of folks who are reporting on this is that that story hasn't yet totally been told. I know that SCAFE May, in the last years of her life, did give a fair amount of money to many of the kind of early aughts right-wing blogosphere, the kind of antecedents to the alt-right. But it's not a ton. It wasn't like a ton of money, and I think that's very much an open question. But the scarier thing to me is that it might actually, and I think the likeliest thing to me is that it is some combination of, yeah, there might be some pretty, substantial donors, whether it's the Mercers or Peter Thiel, like these are good candidates that are, possibly involved. But I think it's also likely that there is a good amount of grassroots fundraising that's going on, that there is an audience for this, and there are people that are, willing to give their money to support these kinds of projects. Like you said, it's not enough to, earn back that $5,000, but like, it's not, this isn't something being conjured out of nothing.
Right. I mean, I like I've said in the past, if someone was to give me $100,000 worth of Facebook ads, that's all I need, and I'll see, and then I become self-perpetuating at that point. And that, I think, is, there's a lot of seed money out there, I think, is what it gets you to a certain point in, in those type of industries that sort of like, like it gets you up into orbit, and then you sort of drift through there. So give us a sense of like the taxonomy of these different groups, and particularly, I mean, let's talk about it in the context of what happened at the Capitol. And then I want to talk about where you think it's headed now. Because, we've watched when we were talking about the Scalise clip, we were talking about like, they've run through, they didn't get that much traction with Mr. Potato Head or with, and, we're too far away for Christmas, for the war on Christmas. They need to talk about something. There is no more policy. And it seems to me that, like, immigration and racism, that's sort of where they'll land.
Yeah. So just to speak briefly about the taxonomy of the far right and the kind of grassroots organizations of the far right. During the Trump years, we saw a kind of explosion and a proliferation of many different groups kind of putting up different banners and saying, that like we kind of trying to make a claim to being the sort of leading organization. And after Heather Heyer's murder in Charlottesville and various kinds of internal movement infighting, and drama, many of those groups collapsed, and the Proud Boys, Gavin McInnes, the organization that Gavin McInnes founded, as ostensibly as a social drinking club for men, which was for a long time kind of a laughingstock of other groups on the far right, and was not, frankly, taken seriously by many journalists who cover the far right or anti-fascist organizers and activists, kind of stepped into the organizational power vacuum and became the home base for a lot of folks. It came to function, I think, as a sort of big tent far right organization. And over the past 2 years or so, has really established itself as a militant, robust organization that can turn people out. In some parts of the country, it has bigger bases of support than others. But this really came to a head on January 6th in Washington, D.C., where it seems clear now that Proud Boys, along with some other organized factions like the Oath Keepers and various kinds of militia organization, older militia groups, were basically the sort of organized cadre moving among the sort of masses of Trump supporters, and providing leadership in this moment of chaos, and kind of providing direction for people. Most of the people that participated in January 6th, and most of the people that have been subsequently charged, are not members of organized groups, but the role that these organized groups played is clearly very significant. And I don't think that we would have gotten that without the, events of the past few years.
What do you think? I mean, and to the extent that you have to speculate, obviously it's speculation, but maybe you've come across this in your reporting. What do you think for those who were part of the organized groups, right? I mean, there are some. I don't know if it was. We spoke to Robert Pape at one point, and they're still having arrests and whatnot. So these figures, but they're 10-15% of those people were from organizations, at least. What do you think their agenda was? Do you have a sense of like how, like, how serious they were as to what they thought was going to happen?
I think they were looking for people to hurt. I don't think that they had any aspirations to, taking over the machinery of the federal government and, exerting themselves on the levers of power. I think they were looking for opportunities to do violence and make a spectacle of it. I think that ultimately is what their politics boil down to. And so, I think you saw this when they reached the inner sanctum of the House of Representatives and kind of didn't really know what to do with themselves because there was nobody there. So yeah, I think their agenda was to hurt people.
I mean, I ask only because, well, maybe, I don't know. It's all secondhand, but I think that they actually thought when they got there that there was other things that were going to happen that they may not have had. I'm not convinced that they were obviously mistaken, and I think there was a tremendous amount of delusion. But I think they thought they were going to bring about some actual change in the outcome of the election. I really. I think some of them actually did that. And I don't know that they knew what the steps were, what the mechanics were. I think they just felt like we need to get to point A. And once we do, everything will happen after that. Mm-hmm. But I don't have firsthand knowledge of that. And so I will leave it at that.
Well,
but
I just curious too, because I know you touch on in your book on Peter Thiel and the fact that he conducted raids during his time of people in his workplace. That was something that I hadn't heard about at all. Before we let you go, I was wondering if you could just touch on that.
Wait, sorry, say that again?
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe this was in some of my notes. Maybe this was from something else. So go on, Sam.
It's all right. But, okay, so I mean, lastly, all right. So, where did they go now? Like, where does this energy? I mean, I imagine part of it is contingent upon on Trump, but where does this go?
Yeah, like you said, it's largely contingent on Trump, and I think that. What I mean when I say that is that it's contingent on kind of the ongoing power struggle within the Republican Party. If the Republican Party is brought back into the kind of, or rather, what we're seeing, okay, so let me back up. What we're seeing subsequent to January 6th is a massive federal crackdown on the participants in the siege and the riot. We're seeing the federal government kind of reasserting its legitimacy, its authority. A line was clearly crossed. But to the extent that these people feel that there is a home for them within the Republican Party, within the kind of ongoing political struggle in the mainstream, sort of above ground. I think that actually like puts a kind of limit on the influence of the currents and the factions and the tendencies within this movement that are saying to people, Trump lost. You believed that he was going to kind of come in on a white horse over the horizon and save the day, but like that didn't happen. Your analysis was all wrong. Actually, this whole process of American democracy is a scam, is a fraud, and there is no political solution to your problems. We are providing, a movement that can answer your problems and can provide an explanation for how the world works. But it requires you to sort of like disavow Trump, disavow the Republican Party, disavow even the semblance of democracy, and embrace this neo-fascist tendency that is still sort of stalking the outskirts of our politics, and that I don't think is going away anytime soon.
How agnostic is that to partisan politics? Because when you talk about this sort of neo-fascist movement disengaging from democracy, disengaging from the Republican Party, disengaging from Trumpism, and it's out there, and it's at its heart, it is, the political system is not going to provide redress for your complaints. If I just stop it there, and don't even talk about a positive agenda per se, and I don't mean positive as in happy, but I mean positive.
No, I know what you mean.
But then I can start to appeal to disaffected people across the ideological spectrum, right? I mean,
right, but it doesn't stop there. I mean, the message is, the message is in service of the establishment of a white ethno state, of the purging of anyone but the chosen few. And this, the message is there is no political solution. The only solution is to disengage from really like society, and retreat to violence in defense of yourself, in defense of your family, and in defense of people who look like you. And that's the only thing that can be counted on in this worldview. And I think that that makes the idea that there are any links or connections or coalitions or ways to like reach across this divide. It makes it very clear to me that no, this is going in a very different direction.
So that, I mean, in that respect, you're saying it's going to get even more marginal, but possibly more dangerous.
I think that is one likely possibility.
What's the other? I mean, I guess the only reason why I ask that is because, there is, there does exist in some quadrants of the left I don't want to say a nihilism, but maybe, but a disaffection that if you don't bring in that explicit, ethno-nationalism, it's just, some form of nationalism. I mean, that's what strikes me when I see Tucker Carlson, when he's talking about the elite and the corporatists and, the professional class, that he's trying to make an appeal to elements on the left that also have that same sort of sense of like the political system is not going to redress my issues. And, it might be at one point like, hey, by the time I got to the fourth meeting, I realized, wait a second, these guys are white. But, the former head of the Proud Boys, Latino. And so, it doesn't, maybe it's not, it may take a while before that becomes explicit to people.
Yeah, I mean, so just to say, the other option is that if the other option is that the Republican Party becomes an explicitly ethno-nationalist party that is abandoned by most of the sectors of capital that support it. Maybe parts of tech still remain involved, parts of the defense industry still remain involved. But if you have a national party that can contest elections, that can govern, and this is the trajectory that the party has taken for 60 years, is towards minoritarian rule, then it's hard to make the case that there is no political solution. In fact, there is a party that is very open to thinking about politics in this way. I would also say that the fascist political tradition for over 100 years has achieved its dynamism by stealing and appropriating left rhetoric and parts of left political analysis. It is, fascism is something that emerges from the crisis of capitalism, but it is not an anti-capitalist movement. But it does take on sort of like anti-bourgeois discourse and language, and is able to sort of offer an analysis of capitalism, which liberalism really doesn't, and conservatism really doesn't. And so you're absolutely right that people like Tucker Carlson on the right, and then there are people who at least position themselves on the left, that want to claim that there is common cause to be made here. But this was just history repeating itself. Like, there's nothing new about that. That also happened during fascism's classical period. But that, I think, is deeply naive and just wrong.
Brenden O'Connor, the book is Blood Red Lines: How Nativism Fuels the Right. Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, quick break. Right back. Finish it up. Well, folks, that is just about it for us today. That was fascinating, fascinating analysis, and I have to say the Scapes, they really did a job on the country. A couple of choice folks with hundreds of millions of dollars and time on their hands can really do some damage to a nation and its psyche. But that is it for us today. For Emma and I, we will see you tomorrow.